Communication's a two-way street. And the more frustrated we get as humans, the worse we communicate with our dogs. Our body language changes, our tone changes. So they're getting just a slew of information that, as we get more and more frustrated, makes them less and less able to work with us.
Welcome back to the Canine Campus Podcast. This is episode number 14. And it's January 2008. Happy New Year, Deven.
Happy New Year, Stace.
It's been a while. It's been since actually June that we've actually published and posted a podcast. So we're turning into more of a biannual affair. But in 2008, sadly, in 2008, we are hoping that
we will post on a more regular
we can be
fashion.
A little more regular about this whole thing. We'd like to thank Elsie for her comment this morning on our blog, who's asking for more things about puppies, and we're going to have that in an upcoming podcast. It's going to be very soon. We also got an email from Rachel last week about the podcast. Thank you for that, Rachel, and we will be addressing those questions as well very soon. Today, we're going to be talking about calming signals. If you're familiar with dog training in any serious respect, you've probably heard about Turid Rugaas and her book, Calming Signals, her videotape on calming signals.
Also, if you've done any therapy dog work, it's mentioned in the Delta Society Home Study Manual, and my bet is it's mentioned in other organizations as well.
Exactly. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. There are some resources that we're going to have at the end. Turid's got some fantastic photographs on her website. We'll have a link to that. We'll also have a link to the videotape we'll have a link to where you can.
Book.
We'll have a link to where you can find that videotape and book as well. But first of all, start us off, Deven. What's important about calming signals? What are they, and why should we know what they are?
I think that one of the most common experiences I have as a dog trainer working with the general public, I'm primarily a family dog trainer. I hear very often someone tell me that their dog is willful, that their dog is stubborn, and more often than not, when I have the opportunity to observe the human and the dog, I see a dog that is confused, that is not being communicated with clearly, and is usually displaying signals to let the owner or handler or human know that. And the human counterpart is not aware of those signals.
They're very subtle, right?
They can be very subtle, and I think that once you're sort of aware of what they can be, they become much easier to see. And in fact, in my therapy dog class, this comes up in therapy work because visits tend to be stressful, and you need to be aware of when your dog has had enough. And one of the ways people do that is by looking for calming signals. And so in our therapy dog class, we actually go over the book and the photos, and I've had a lot of people kind of have, these aha moments. Oh,
right.
My dog always yawned when she was getting her nails clipped, and I never knew that it was stress related. So I think it's really important. We spend a lot of time with this particular species trying to get them to understand us. And we're a verbal species, and dogs not so much. And most of our training is about, hey, I'm going to say a word and I would like you to do something in return for that. Dogs, on the other hand, only have so many tools at their disposal to let us know where their head's at and what might be informing their decisions at any given moment. And I think calming signals is a really good way to start understanding what your dog is all about. So Turid Rugaas wrote a book called Calming Signals, What Does Your Dog Tell You? A number of years ago. And Turid Rugaas is a woman, she lives in Norway, and she is not a scientist, but she is a lifelong dog trainer and dog lover. And what she asserts in that book is that in an attempt to keep peace within the pack, dogs display certain ritualized behaviors to each other to encourage calmness in the pack. Now, the scientific community as a whole is kind of up in the air about whether or not these signs are intended to keep peace in the pack.
Right.
Because keep in mind that pack warfare is expensive and dangerous from the pack's perspective. I mean, if a breeding dog is injured, if a good hunter is injured, a feral dog pack can really get into trouble if there's been, unfortunate warfare. So it's expensive. It can really undermine the well-being of the entire pack. So, that's why Turid asserts that their primary goal is to keep peace within the pack. Interestingly enough, most of our house dogs are living in a pack that's made up more of humans than dogs. And, but these calming signals remain. What the scientific community does agree on, like I said, they're not sure whether or not these are actually intended to calm other dogs, but there's certainly behaviors that dogs display when they're stressed. And so, at the very least, are they an attempt for a dog to dissipate their own stress and to kind of calm themselves down?
Right. And I think it's worth mentioning that if you watch Turid's video, what you'll notice is she makes very keen observations. She's been making these observations for a long time.
Yes.
My impression, she almost works as a dog pack anthropologist. She's somebody from the outside that's been viewing these things for a long time. She's collected a lot of information. There's no telling exactly what the intentions of the dogs are, but the observations she's made seem to kind of over time really add up.
I think that's an
to
accurate assessment of her. I saw her at an APTT conference a few years ago, and she's Norwegian.
Right.
Obviously, English is not her first language, and not at all the easiest language to command when it's not your first language. And so a lot of her talks, unfortunately, were kind of bogged down with semantics, and I really think it was just translation, not anything more than semantics. But she definitely is her own sort of category in the dog training world, and I don't know a dog trainer who doesn't find what she sort of illuminated for the world incredibly useful when working with dogs. And I know without a doubt personally, they have prevented me from getting hurt on a number of occasions. I think they're really valuable things to know. So we're going to talk about them, and I want to make clear that these signals, you need to evaluate them within the context that they occur. And so one of the most common signals is yawning. And the second I tell people that, they say...
hopefully none of our listeners are doing yet.
Right. It's power of suggestion. And, obviously, every single time a dog yawns, it isn't necessarily trying to calm. But I can tell you from my own personal observation, my bet is 85% of the time that a dog yawns, at least in my presence. And keep in mind, that can be a somewhat stressful environment if they're coming for behavioral work. It is stress related. And what this means, what these calming signals tell you, when you see them and can start identifying them in your own dog, is your dog is letting you know that they are stressed. And are you in a situation where you can help reduce that stress? So we talked about therapy work earlier. If your dog's displaying stress in a therapy environment, can you get him out of that particular interaction, out of that particular room? Is it time to end your visit altogether? So I find that when people are working with their dog with me, they feel a certain amount of pressure, right? The trainer's standing right there.
Right.
And they want their dog on their best behavior. No matter why they've come to me, they want their dog on their best behavior. They ask their dog to sit. Their dog sat 5,000 times at home. Their dog does not sit. And they get stressed and slightly embarrassed, and they feel somewhat pressured because, once again, I'm standing there and they feel like they're being scrutinized. And that stress completely translates to the dog. And this is when I start seeing a lot of calming signals.
It goes right down the leash.
Even if no leash is attached, it comes out of your pores. And so that's when I hear people say things like, well, you know this. you do this at home all the time. And one of the things I'm hoping in this podcast is to get people, when they find that that's the path they're going down, this you know this.
The path of
You're
frustration.
just being stubborn. You're just being willful. When they actually think, when they're starting to go down the path where they're setting up a kind of, not confrontation with the dog, but a kind of, you are willfully trying to embarrass me. You are being difficult on purpose.
And the handler's exhibiting frustration.
That's the time to sit back and say, wait a minute. How am I not communicating the things that I need to communicate? How am I not taking into consideration environmental elements that may be stressful to the dog or highly distracting to the dog? I mean, I think one of the biggest problems people make is they teach their dog stay at home, and then they go to a busy, crowded shopping center and they expect their dog to sit there. Right. Well, when you teach your dog sit at home, that's kindergarten sit. When you're in the middle of a busy, crowded shopping center, that's a PhD sit. There has to be a lot of work in between. Right? You've got to do your first grade sits, which is out in your front yard. And then you've got to do your sixth grade sits, which might be near your bus stop where kids are coming and going. And then you've got to do your high school sit. You've got to really work up to it. And usually by the time people come to our basic obedience class, for them, their dog already knows sit at home. Being able to do it in a room with 5 or 6 other dogs, that's kind of a high school sit. I mean, there's big distractions. There's a lot more interesting things to do, like play with that dog a few feet away. So it's under those kind of circumstances when people do not kind of take into account all the challenges that the dog is working with to try to work with you.
Right.
They get frustrated and they start asking for the dog things that the dogs cannot deliver because they're so stressed. And this is when I start seeing calming signals. So yawning is one of the most common signals I see. I see it a lot in vetting situations. I see it a lot in grooming situations. It's a pretty dramatic one. Interestingly enough, Turid yawns to her dogs when she tries to, when she feels they need to be calmed down, when she feels that her dogs are stressed, she starts doing sort of big exaggerated yawns. And it's not 1 or 2, you have to do like 10 or 20 in a row. I find that some dogs are incredibly sensitive to them. I find other dogs not at all. Right. At least from a human to a dog. That just because a dog doesn't respond to my yawning at it doesn't mean it won't respond to another dog.
Right.
I mean, dogs know we're not dogs. That I'm sure of. So let's talk about some other ones. A really common one, but it's very hard to see, is looking away.
Right.
And that's usually nothing more than an eye slide. The head itself doesn't turn. How I think most humans would encounter this with their dogs is their dog's refusal to make eye contact.
Right.
That is very often a common signal.
And Turid does distinguish between looking away and a full-blown turning of the head.
Well, it's not that she distinguishes, it's that one is a more amplified version.
Okay.
So, it starts with kind of the avoidance of the eye and the eye slide, and when that doesn't work, then dogs tend to turn their whole head away, and then they can turn their whole body away. And a perfect example of this is the first time I ever took our husky for her therapy dog test, first time I'd ever tested her for certification. We came into the room. I was incredibly nervous. I had not tested for this before. There was a lot of baggage in that room that had nothing to do with her, and I was really overwhelmed. And we walked in there, and she turned her back on me, would not respond to her name, would not sit. If I swung around in front of her to try to get her attention, she would turn on me again. Now, a lot of people in that situation would be incredibly frustrated. I was. Embarrassed. I was. You're in a room full of people. They're evaluating you and your dog. And it wasn't, we didn't even actually get to do the first exercise in the therapy dog exam. I could not get her to engage with me at all. And after 5 minutes, I thought, well, this is kind of going nowhere. And I'm very frustrated. And it really wasn't until I calmed down enough and I was driving home that I thought, I freaked her out. I was so nervous, and it really affected my communication skills, and all the things that she relied upon from me in our communication system fell apart, having nothing to do with her. And that was her way of saying, you're freaking me out. I need you to turn down the volume of your stress. So it starts with the looking away. Like I said, that's often, I think, it's easier to interpret that as an unwillingness to make eye contact. When that doesn't work, it becomes a head turn. When that doesn't work, it becomes a full body turn. Another really subtle one that I tend to see, but I think this is the hardest one for humans to see. Well, for starters, very often when I'm working with people, their dog is next to them and I'm facing them, and you have to be of facing a dog to see this. The licking. It's just a very subtle flick.
Licking of the lips, licking of the nose.
Yes, and it's very quick and it's very subtle, but it's often repeated. And, once again, you have to look at the context. We've talked in other podcasts about the ventral nasal organ, which is in the roof of the dog's mouth, right behind their front teeth. And often the flicking of the lip is also helping to bring, or the tongue is helping to bring social information across the ventral nasal organ.
Right.
But it is one of the most common, I think that and yawning, and I think the first three we've talked about are probably the most common ones that I see. And I see them every day, all day.
Right.
Slow movements. This is where dogs sort of have an exaggerated slowness to their movements. And I see this actually more often than not, dogs with each other. Dogs that are uncertain of each other. They're put into a social situation. They're not very sure of themselves. And that's where I kind of see this sort of exaggerated pausing and movement.
Right.
There's also sitting and lying down, otherwise known as freezing. So some dogs, especially if you've worked on sit a lot, and many people have, they don't want their dog jumping up. Some dogs, in the absence of knowing what else to do, sit, because that's had good results in the past, and that tends to be the least stressful thing to do. So I've definitely seen dogs, when asked to do a million other things, get confused, get stressed out, and fall back on what they know, sitting or lying down, or just freezing. I actually see freezing a lot with resource guarders. If you go to take something from a dog and they haven't been properly taught how to give things to you, and they're worried. I mean, some dogs you can take anything you want from. Some dogs get worried. They freeze. They just freeze.
Which can be frightening.
When a dog freezes, I take a big, giant step backwards.
Well, and going back to what calming signals are or may be, things like freezing, it's not only a calming signal perhaps, but it's a sign that the dog is in a really uncomfortable place. And the best thing you can possibly do, because the reason I mention it is it's our experience that on occasion, and it's not necessarily every occasion, but on occasion, freezing can be leading to a bite.
Well, what freezing is, absolutely, it's a dog kind of waiting to see what you're going to do. And, are you going to move further into their space so they have to amplify their response to you, which could be a growl, a lunge, a bite. For some dogs, it's if you move into their space, they turn around and head in the opposite direction. If they have the opportunity, often when I'm working with, when I have been called in on resource guarding situations, when dogs have bitten, they have been cornered, either under a bed or in a physical corner, and their option for fleeing was removed.
Right.
So in the absence of that, they did what they had to. So freezing is a complicated dog behavior. I think it can have a lot of meanings. In my experience, I see it less in kind of the normal casual interactions with dogs. For me, it's much more context specific, sort of resources are in the, or once again, I see this with dogs in social situations with each other. And often it precedes, rah, 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 rah. I need more space, back off. Okay, sniffing. This this falls into, Turid differentiates between sniffing and doing something else. I sort of call them the same thing.
Yeah.
And I call it the la-da-da-da-da-da-da.
Right, and I thought that doing something else was a very interesting signal, because when you see it in the context, especially, and this is why her video is so wonderful.
It's so good.
It makes so much sense, because
it's very calming, though.
She
and it
gives
is
you
long.
several examples. It's a very calming video. It's
do not have a glass of wine.
It's an anthropological study again. It's a social study. But when you see it in the video, you'll start seeing it in real life.
I think it really helps to see it in action. And I had read the book first and found it very interesting and became more mindful of calming signals. But it really wasn't until I saw the video that I started to get much more kind of fluid in picking them up without even thinking twice about it. I mean, I think I process them now without even really drawing my attention to it. It's like, oh, there's a calming signal, there's a calming signal.
Right.
And with sniffing and doing something else, it's like, I see this a lot when, once again, people are trying to do what they've been requested to do in class. Please have your dog sit or lie down.
Yeah.
And their dog doesn't do it the first time, and they start getting a little stressed and frustrated and embarrassed, and they sort of turn it on strong, and their dog sort of does this, sort of looks around and starts sniffing and kind of walks away, and it's just, and that's when they're like, quit being difficult. It's like, no, quit overwhelming your dog. So I consider sniffing and doing something else kind of one and the same.
Right.
Curving. It's interesting if you see many different dogs meeting each other for the first time. And I don't mean in a dog park situation where there's a group going on and another dog enters it. I mean, kind of one-on-one dogs, how unfamiliar dogs approach each other and assess each other. So it's very rare for dogs to walk up to each other nose to nose. They almost always approach from the side.
Right.
And of course, they're trying to get to the nose and the fanny where all this information, all this important social information resides. One of the reasons why, and we talked about this in an earlier podcast on leash reactivity.
Right.
We have leash reactivity when off leash, many dogs are fine, is because we walk them right up to each other's noses face to face.
Right.
Curving is basically dogs doing this sort of big sideways approach to each other. It almost looks like two C's coming from opposite direction. I mean the letter C's.
Yeah.
And
arcs.
And Turid looks at this as a calming signal. I actually see this more as a polite greeting ritual. It's the difference between you walking up to a stranger on the street and kissing them on the mouth versus you walking up to a stranger on the street and shaking their hands. So I look at this as just a polite greeting ritual. She sees it as a calming signal. I think it is calming because it's an appropriate socialized behavior. But
right.
Play bows. So interesting. We wouldn't even know about play bows if it weren't for Mark Beckoff and the work that he has done with, he's done some work with, is it coyotes or wolves? I believe it's wolves. And it turns out they mean something totally different in the wolf world than the dog world. And Mark Beckoff is most notably known for his work with play. Oh. He's worked a lot with Jane Goodall, too. And he's kind of the first person that brought to our attention that in order for there to be play within a species, there has to be a concept of fairness, which I think is so lovely. And he really saw this with primates. But anyway, play bowing, we often see this as a precursor to play. And how Mark Beckoff defines it loosely is that this is an indication when I give a play bow that what follows it is not to be taken seriously.
Right.
So if I give a play bow and I, hop at you and I bark at you and I chase you all around, it's just for fun. It's not the precursor to anything serious. I don't see a lot of play bowing as a calming signal except with very submissive dogs. So I see it with dogs that are, and in fact, surprise, our little 16 or 17 month old, when he is worried about new people, he play bows to them. And so I see it a lot in him. And then there's marking. Hard to tell when that's just marking and when that's a calming signal. I'm not sure I could even
as
differentiate.
with all calming signals, sometimes it's hard to tell, but it's something that you can, I think, once it's a part of your vocabulary and context, it'll make a lot of sense.
Well, Turid says, hey, it can be merely territorial, but it can also be a social activity. I sort of feel that's the same, two sides of the same coin, so to speak. I think that when you're marking a territory, you are laying out social information.
Right.
So, splitting up. Our husky is very good at this.
She is, yes.
Splitting up, you see this in groups of dogs playing. A dog coming in and splitting up, it just almost by...
Physically.
Yeah, physically, but just sort of with their body. I mean, it's not like they use their mouth or anything. They just sort of go right in between to split up the dogs and sort of calm down the play. And our husky's a big fan of this. She's sort of the Miss Manners of the dog play world. And she likes peace in the pack more than anything in the world. And if there's even a whiff of heightened arousal, even if it's fun, she gets worried and says, everyone, let's, hey, kids, someone's going to get hurt. Let's just calm down. And then... the last one, so interesting, lifting paw. Yeah. This almost looks like a dog is inviting you to shake. And what I think is really interesting about this is often the clients whose dogs do this taught their dog shake because their dog did it so much. Like their dog was just naturally kind of lifting their paw and they turned it into a shake. And so they'll say to me, no, my dog isn't stressed. I've taught my dog shake.
Right.
And it's like, oh, I can assure you your dog is stressed because other calming signals are happening too. And basically it's a carryover from puppy behavior. It's a puppy appeasement behavior. So when puppies felt like they had upset their mommy or other pack members, they lift their little paw and they lick little mouths, and that's their way of saying, I'm sorry, I'm a puppy, I don't know what I'm doing. So lifting paw, you don't see that often, but when you see it, it's usually the dog's big repertoire. Those are calming signals, and as you said earlier, I think it's really helpful to see them. Turid Rugaas has pictures of them on her site, which we'll have a link to.
Yes, she not only does she have pictures, she actually has, if you click through a little deeper, turns out those pictures link to her actual slideshow.
Oh, great.
Which will give you a little information of what she talks about. But as you mentioned before, really the video is priceless for helping people who are training dogs expand their vocabulary of what they're seeing in the training process, and having, again, this is a social science. It's perhaps not as exact as chemistry or biology.
I think this is actually a wonderful introduction. I think it's a wonderful introduction to the novice dog handler's repertoire. I think,
or the advanced that hasn't experienced
absolutely.
Turid's work
And the thing
before.
is most people that have worked a lot with dogs, even if they don't know Turid Rugaas or her calming signal specifically, they have seen these ritualized behaviors. They've identified them through experience.
Right.
But I think that this is kind of one of the first things I turn new dog owners onto, because I think that communication needs to be a two-way street.
Right.
And often the greatest frustration in dog training is that you don't know what the dog's thinking. How they can give you feedback is so limited.
Right.
And to be aware of these things really will reduce your frustration in dog training, I think, greatly. And also, may I say, I use this a lot in aggression cases, because it can give humans who are dealing with dogs that have aggression issues a lot of information to help them manage and prevent actual biting.
Right.
It's like if you can get your dog out of a stressful situation before it escalates. And may I say this, that dogs living in the world that we live in encounter stress. Like, there's much in our modern world that from an evolutionary point of view, not really something they were prepared for.
Right.
But
exactly.
they've been willing to live with us for a long time. They put up with a lot of our stuff.
Yeah.
And so there isn't a dog, it's a rare dog in the therapy dog environment that doesn't display calming signals. And that doesn't mean that your dog's a mess or stressed out. It just means that, hey, I'm a little stressed out and maybe a little break would be good. Hey, could I go outside to go to the bathroom? When I see it when I'm training, I start playing with my dogs. I ask for something simple.
Right.
I try to be more lighthearted.
You bring down the stress level because you're perceiving that it might be a little rough on him at the moment.
Exactly.
Right?
And also I think that it lets me know that at that moment in time, I'm not really communicating as clearly as I think I am.
Right.
And I think that, we get so frustrated when our dogs don't do what we want them to do, and it's really hard in that moment for us to take responsibility for our part in that. Communication's a two-way street. And the more frustrated we get as humans, the worse we communicate with our dogs. Our body language changes, our tone changes, the chemicals that our body produces that dogs pick up change. Mm-hmm. So they're getting just a slew of information that, as we get more and more frustrated, makes them less and less able to work with us. And so my goal is to not see a calming signal in a training session. And I think that that's really helped me incorporate much more play and lighthearted activity. And this is one of the reasons why I teach tricks in every single class. Because, people get all serious when they teach sit, but they're goofballs when they teach take a bow.
Right.
Well, sit and take a bow are the same thing to a dog. It's all a trick to them.
Right, exactly.
So
and it's going to be a lot more effective in your
lighthearted.
training session if you're having fun with it.
I've said it in the past on the show. I'm going to say it again. If you can't train with a smile on your face, don't train.
Right, exactly.
You're not in the frame of mind.
Exactly. Well, we're talking about Turid Rugaas. The name of the book is On Talking Terms with Dogs. The name of the video is Calming Signals, What Your Dog Tells You. We're going to have links to both of those in our show notes. This is the Canine Campus Podcast. We'll be back in a few weeks. Thanks, Deven. Happy New Year.
Same to you.
We'll talk to you soon.
All right.
All right, bye.